everybody. Sorry I can't be there with you, first of all, but today we're learning about comma rules. So you probably know a lot of these. These are probably some of the more common ones that we're going to talk about first. I'm going to try to do this in one shot and get through this as quickly as possible, but you should be taking notes, of course, on anything with a green dot next to it or square, and anything else that I might mention here that you should write down. There's a couple of different things that you're going to want to pay attention to. So, all right. First, you want to use commas to separate three or more words, phrases, or clauses in a series. This is when they don't contain other commas. We talked about that, the semicolon being also a way you could do that when items in the series contain commas. However, if they don't contain commas, then of course that's what a comma is going to do. So, for example, Alaska, Texas, California are three largest states. You're going to put a comma in between each item on the series. And yes, I do. They call this the Oxford comma. I do think that you should put a comma there. I really don't like. I think that's one of the things that makes English really hard, is that people. There are all these rules that are rules, except for when they're not rules. And so I think the debate is kind of a goofy one. So you should do it, right? The movie was long, dull, and humorless. They have traveled on land, by sea, and air, and so on. So when items are separated by conjunctions, commas are unnecessary. So if you do have a conjunction, they say that they're unnecessary, and that's what kind of leads into why the Oxford comma isn't so necessary. But if you have a series of three things, even if it has a conjunction, put a comma in between it. If you have two things and you have a conjunction in between it, then you don't need a comma. That's where you don't need it. Okay. All right. So nouns used in pairs, eggs and bacon, salt and pepper are considered single units and should not be separated by commas. Pork and beans would be another example, right? It's one thing. So you don't need to do it in that situation. So, all right. So the storm brought thunder and lightning, high winds, and heavy rain. Okay. Moving on. Comma, place a comma between coordinate adjectives that precede a noun. So coordinate adjectives are simply adjectives, two adjectives that describe the same noun. And they modify it to an equal degree. So they're not working together to modify that noun. They're separate. Okay. You can tell whether an adjective in a sentence is coordinate by reversing the order. All right. If you can reverse the order and it still makes sense and doesn't change anything, then they're coordinate, right? Or if you can put the word and in between them, it's coordinate. So, for example, it was a warm, starry, fragrant evening. I can put those in any order. It was a fragrant, warm, and starry evening, and it's still going to be the same. And so that's how you know those are coordinate adjectives. And when you have coordinate adjectives, you got to put a comma in between them, right? Avoid placing a comma between adjectives that precede a noun if they sound strange, with their order reversed, or with and between them. In general, don't use a comma between adjectives that describe size, shape, age, color, or material, like the big old oak desk stood in one corner of the room. These are not coordinate adjectives. They are all working together. All right, some but not all of the adjectives in a series may require commas between them. So like a noisy, dusty Japanese truck roared down the street. All right, commas in compound sentences. So this is something that we've talked about already when we talked about different clauses and phrases, and we've talked about the fanboys, right? You want to use a comma after the first independent clause when you're using a coordinating conjunction in between two main clauses. And just a reminder, your coordinating conjunctions are your fanboys, and, or, but, yet, nor, so, and for. A couple examples here. I told Eartha what he said, and she advised me to forget it. I picked up the clay jar carefully, yet it crashed to the floor. Okay, when two very short, closely linked main clauses are connected by a coordinating conjunction, you can omit the comma. Again, this is one of those things that I really don't like about the English. Like, it's the rule unless it's not a rule. I would tell you, just go ahead and ignore that and just put a comma in there. If you have two main clauses and you have a coordinating conjunction, put your comma at the end of the first main clause. Okay. And so I would be looking for that in your exercise versus not. All right. First exercise is exercise 11. You don't need to rewrite the sentence. You just need to use the two words before and two words after where you're going to place the comma. Okay. There are a couple here that need no comma, and for those you can write correct. All right. Hispanic culture is complex, diverse, and rich in many historical traditions. That's your first one. And so this would be a series of 3, right? Hispanic culture is complex, comma, diverse, comma, and rich. It would be your answer. So you can give me, like, since those are all together, you can just give me the is complex, comma, diverse, comma, and rich. And that would be plenty for your answer. I'll know exactly what part of the sentence you're talking about. Okay, one more. It has been a vibrant, vital part of American life ever since Spanish friars settled in the Southwest in the 16th century. So, right here, you have coordinate adjectives, vibrant and vital. You notice that you can switch them around. You can say vital, vibrant part or vibrant, vital part. Either way. And it's gonna make sense. So that's how you know their coordinates. So you just put a comma right in between them right there. And again, vibrant, comma, vital part would be the answer that I would be looking for. All right, moving on. Okay, so we've talked about non-essential or non-restrictive elements quite a bit. We talked about them in particular when we talked about positives. But we talked about some other things, participles, infinitives, and their phrases. When they're not essential, you use commas to set them off. Remember, a participle is a verb that's acting, or a verb phrase that's acting as an adjective. An infinitive is most often acting as a noun, but it can act as other things. And so this is what they're going to look like. And you want to use commas to set them off when they're not essential, right? So, for example, he read engrossed until the doorbell broke his concentration. Engrossed would be a participle, right? And so, but it's not needed because it's not part of the sentence. It just tells you how, right? How he read. I am not very thirsty to tell the truth. This would be your infinitive phrase. So you don't need that information. You can offset it with a comma. If participles, infinitives, and their phrases are essential to the meaning of a sentence, do not set them off with commas. If you got to have it, then you can't set it off with commas. It's necessary, right? The girl watching us is my sister. The participle phrase tells us which girl. Remember, that's typically how you can tell if it's essential or non-essential. If it specifies something specific, then it's going to be essential. Or if it clarifies, right? It's the most precise identifier. All right, to study my notes would not help much. All right, there's an infinitive phrase, and it's the subject of the sentence. So you can't have a sentence without a subject. It wouldn't be complete if that's the case. All right, adjective clauses. So use a comma to set off a non-essential adjective clause. This is a clause that provides additional information about a noun, considering an extra clause. It does not change the meaning of the sentence, but it adds to it, is therefore set off with commas, right? Jackson Pollock, who was an American painter, was born in 1912. Who was an American painter is non-essential. It's not the most precise identifier, but it just tells you who Jackson Pollock was. Now, if it was reversed and you had who was the American painter Jackson Pollock, then you wouldn't be able to put commas around it, right? So do not use commas with an essential adjective clause. An essential or restrictive clause gives necessary information, again, about a noun and is thus needed to convey the exact meaning of the sentence. So one of the few American writers whom she read was Langston Hughes, whom she read as essential clause, right? Because it tells you who he is. All right, a positive. So positives, if you don't remember, they rename something that came right before, or they rename or they add information. And sometimes you got to have them and sometimes you don't. It's all a matter of which one is the most precise identifier in the second position. So, and I'll give you an example. So I would consider this the first position. I would consider this the second position. So which one of these two is the most precise identifier? Well, if you said the person's name, you're correct. And because the person's name is first and not in the second position, this is not essential information, right? This is the most precise identifier. So this would be considered non-essential for me. It's helpful to know that about Lucha Corpi, but you don't have to know it, right? And when you have that situation, you got to rope it off with commas, right? A historic city, New Orleans, was originally settled by the French. So this comma is here because a historic city is not the most important thing to the sentence, right? This is your subject, right? An essential or restrictive appositive is not set off with commas. Again, it's because it's more precise, right? Both the Iliad and the Odyssey are traditionally attributed to the poet Homer. All right, so the poet in this case is not the most precise identifier, and it's in the first position. Homer, which is in the second position, is the most precise identifier, and so because that's his name, and so you gotta have that. All right. Commas with interjections, parenthetical expressions, and conjunctive adverbs. So interjections, just a reminder, have no grammatical connection to the sentence. They typically express like an emotion, like ouch or golly or gee whiz, something like that. Parenthetical expressions and conjunctive adverbs. Conjunctive adverbs are another way you can bring together independent clauses, just as a reminder. So you want to use commas to set off interjections such as "oh" and "well," parenthetical expressions such as "on the contrary," "on the other hand," and "in fact." You always put those after, by the way, and same with conjunctive adverbs. You're always going to put that comma after, because in front of those conjunctive adverbs, you got to have a semicolon, and it's got to be, especially when it's in between two independent clauses. However, if it's not in between two independent clauses, then you would put a comma on both sides of it. So here are a couple examples, right? So here's an interjection. Yes, I hope to build my own home one day. All right, next one. The beautiful and historic city of Philadelphia, in fact, is 3 centuries old. So you're offsetting this with commas because this is not in between two independent clauses. Here's a verb right here, a linking verb is, and so there wouldn't be a need for a semicolon right here. However, if both sides of this were independent clauses, this couldn't be a comma anymore. It would have to be a semicolon. Okay, after all, comma, we did the best we possibly could under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, right? After all doesn't need to be there, right? We drank 2 bottles of orange juice last night. Semicolon, consequently, comma, we did not have enough left to make the punch today. So I want to point this out because consequently falls in between two independent clauses. Can't put a comma here. It's got to be a semicolon. But you use the word however quite a bit, and not always in between two independent clauses. And in that situation, if it's not needed, it would be a comma on both sides of it. But when it falls in between two main clauses, you got to have it. And remember, a main clause and an independent clause, those are the same thing. Okay. All right. She intended to use the money to buy an expensive stereo nonetheless, right? Nonetheless, at the end there is set off with a comma. All right. Exercise 12 is your last exercise. And so you have a paragraph here and you have to find where the commas go. Again, I don't need you to rewrite this whole paragraph, but I want the two. I want you to put the 2 words in front of where you think a comma goes and the 2 words after where it goes. And that will be sufficient. And I would just go sentence by sentence, which means there could be more than one comma, particularly if you have a series of 3 in any of these. So just keep that in mind. You could have more than one comma in one of these sentences. And again, this one may have, it looks like this one has 2 sentences of the 10 that are correct. So they don't need anything. So you're looking for 2 that are just fine. Okay. All right. If you guys have any questions about this or you're confused, we'll sort it out on Thursday, right? This will be due on Friday of this week. So save your questions for Thursday. And I will be glad to help them. I'll give you a little bit of time right before you do notes to just ask me any questions that you have or anything that you didn't understand about it. Have a great day and be kind to your sub. I'll see you guys on Thursday.